Welcome everybody to Impressions Gallery on Instagram Live. I'm Pippa Oldfield, the head of programme at Impressions Gallery, and I'm here with Melanie Friend to unveil her new book, The Plain, published by Dowie Lewis. And this is part of our bite-sized book fair, which is a programme of short talks on Instagram Live as part of our online photo book fair 2020. And you can find out all the details and more talks on our website, which is www.impressions-gallery.com. So for those of you that don't know Melanie, in brief, in the 80s and 90s, she worked as a photojournalist before focusing on the wider aspects of war through long-term photographic projects, such as Border Country, No Place Like Home, Echoes from Kosovo, the Homefront, which we showed at Impressions Gallery a few years ago and worked together on the book there, and her new book and project now, which is called The Plain. So Melanie, it's great to have you here. Tell us a bit about the book and where is the plain in question and why is it of interest?
So it's actually about Salisbury Plain, which is in Wiltshire, and that's about 45 miles south of Bristol and about 100 miles or so west of London. It's the largest military training area in the UK. And it seems to be of interest to all sorts of people, you know, aside from the military, archaeologists, it's a very ancient space, ornithologists, botanists, and dogwalkers, to name a few. And it is, you know, an old ancient landscape dotted with Neolithic burial sites, Bronze Age burial sites. So it is actually both a conservation area and a landscape on which the military train for war. So it's full of contradictions, really.
And just to show them, I just realised we actually unveiled, and I've literally just opened this package now, which is very exciting. So it looks beautiful, and that's the cover of the book.
Thank you, Pippa. So The Plain is a study of this very particular landscape. I mean, it's parts of it. I couldn't cover the whole thing. And then, you know, through talking with local inhabitants as well, I also found out that it's really also about the normalization of the military presence in the English countryside. So I might go into that more later if there's time.
What was the spark for the project, Melanie? How did you, what gave you the idea to photograph this?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Homefront, which actually was exhibited 7 years ago. I can't believe it was such a long time ago, but it was, and published as well by Dowie Lewis and Impressions Gallery 7 years ago. And there I was focusing on air displays and the disruption of the landscape, the disruption of the seascape from these kind of displays of military fighter jets overhead. But actually that work was really quite different because it's quite event dependent. So I traveled to air shows on particular days throughout the country, whereas here on Salisbury Plain, I'm working with a more limited geographical space, and the disruption of the landscape by the military in the present is random and it can't be predicted. Although of course there are all these signs and symbols that indicate the military presence throughout the landscape. So on the one hand, I was kind of working as a landscape photographer. You know, you're waiting in a particular spot for a particular cloud to come into the frame. You're waiting for the weather to change. You know, there's a lot of patience involved, as every photographer out there knows. And then on the other hand, this element of chance, of a touch of reportage, if you like. So I found that very, very fascinating. In terms of the actual lead up to the project, I started on a different tack. I started in Dorset in 2014 after I took a really stunning coastal path walk down across the Lulworth Ranges, and in the distance there were rusty tanks, and that's where the Lulworth camp military would practice. But in the end, for sort of practical and emotional reasons, I switched my focus to Salisbury Plain, near my mother, who's almost 92. And when I started photographing on Salisbury Plain, it didn't feel as enticing as that really dramatic Lulworth kind of cliff seascape and everything. So it was quite a challenge and a slow process of finding the photographs that really worked for me. And it's a very different kind of space, and it's a landscape, you know, really full of history and mystery. And Pippa, you've got, I think, an indication there of one of the images that was a very early image that I took. So hopefully those of you on Instagram will be able to
Not sure
see this
if
image, but
but did
that
you?
was really the first image for me that worked, and you know, was quite sort of odd and mysterious, and it's a sign reminding the military not to dig in that particular space because it was an archaeological site. But again, coming back to a particular spark, I would say it was when one day I was just standing out there. It was silent, beautiful silence. I'm looking into the very mysterious and inaccessible impact area, which is where, you know, the bombs are tested and the firing happens. So, you know, general public are not allowed in there. And larks were singing above my head. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, erupted this firing from a copse, which I couldn't see. So that was just unbelievable experience. It's completely usual for the locals, but for me, it was very, very startling and very, very shocking. And of course, I started making sound recordings as well, which if there is an exhibition in the future, I'm hoping to be able to use some sound as well.
Yeah, great. And what's your own personal connection to this landscape? Is there a personal connection for you?
Well, I think there's a personal connection to military themes in a way, because you know, I was born in 1957, so I grew up with all these stories of the Second World War. And my grandfather first fought in the First World War, my father in the Second World War, like many people of my generation. So I also grew up with stories of the Blitz, and my father actually trained on Salisbury Plain. He trained, wow. 19 years old when he was training at Lark Hill, which is the School of Artillery on Salisbury Plain, in 1940. And then he went out to the Iraq desert for 3 years in World War II. So that's always been very part of my history. But my father got out of the army as soon as the war ended. But those stories are there. Right. And then, so the other thing I think is interesting is that although I've been a Londoner for 43 years, I was actually brought up in a very conservative rural area. So at the beginning of this project, it was interesting kind of going back into my past, really, spending time in this very rural area. And yet there's another kind of background spark as well, which is, as a young photojournalist in the 1980s, I used to photograph the peace movement a great deal. So, you know, I spent quite a lot of time in the mud outside military bases, you know, with all these perimeter fences and photographing protests all over England, including at Greenham Common, the American and RAF base that was in Berkshire, and that's actually not far from Salisbury Plain. So although I didn't actually focus on the bases and barracks that are in Wiltshire for this project, you know, I was revisiting military areas. And I mean, part of the reason I didn't focus on the barracks is that, of course, there are official secret signs everywhere and no photography signs everywhere, but also visually, it didn't interest me. It wasn't where the heart of the work was for me, really.
Should we talk a bit about, I feel like I want to show some more pictures actually, but I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the, you know, the challenges you faced making the work and, you know, the access and how it was to be there in the landscape.
Yeah. I mean, there were quite a lot of challenges, but I kind of like challenges. I'm
just going to show.
There are places like this, which is called Beech's Barn, where I went several times, and I went there a couple of times on my own, but I actually felt very, you know, I felt it was a very kind of sinister space. I really love the tree that comes over the whole scene. And I didn't want to photograph there on my own. So when I went with a tripod, when I had to hang out in a space like that for a much longer period of time, I had somebody with me for safety. And in fact, a young friend of mine, Lou, you know, she and I were quite threatened in another part of the plain where there's no mobile coverage, you know, you're quite isolated. And some guys in a white van just zoomed up to us. Unbelievable, really. It's very frightening. We had to make a hasty kind of exit. So there is a little bit of crime on the plain, and you just have to keep your wits about you. But the vast majority of the time, you know, I was fine. I was happy just being in the landscape. I was really happy being away from my computer.
I think
Just being in the outside.
Sympathize with that right now. Yeah.
And I'm sure everybody out there is thinking, oh my God, you know, you just want more time away from computer things right now, I'm sure. But anyway, yeah, and there were, I mean, other kinds of challenges were, I mean, there's always the weather and that kind of thing, but that makes it fun.
What about the military and that kind of access? Was that?
The access, yes. So actually, I worked independently of the press office, and so I didn't ever photograph those kind of mock battles that sometimes press photographers are brought together to photograph these kind of battle scenarios, you know. And you can see plenty of those kinds of images online, which are much more close up, you know, close up of soldiers and fatigues and tanks and manoeuvres and all that kind of thing. Not being a press photographer, I would have had to pay for that kind of special access. And actually, I decided I didn't want those close up dramatic images anyway. You know, for me, I was getting more and more into the landscape itself, and the landscape was kind of holding sway for me. And I wasn't doing reportage work, you know. But what that meant was that any encounters that I did have with the military were very random, you know. Yeah, I did actually get stopped by the military about 4 times and asked what I was doing. And yeah, there's another image I can show which actually shows that. Oh, where was that? Oh, yes, this one.
Yeah.
So there's a Land Rover actually in that image. I don't know if anyone could see it on the right hand side. And that Land Rover then zoomed over to me and Louise and asked me what I was doing. But it was fine once the officer realized I was using a wide angle lens and I wasn't focusing on anyone's faces, you know. It was okay.
I'm just saying it's really hard for people viewing to see the amazing detail in these images. But what's fascinating is, although they're landscapes, there's all of this traces of a human presence, and sometimes that military or human presence is in there in the details, and you have to look quite carefully for it. So it's a bit hard to show on this small screen, but I, you know, really encouraged you to kind of actually have a look at the book itself, where you can see that.
Yes, I mean, I've got notes at the back, which are not quite like captions, but sometimes that is trying to give a little bit more historical context or information to those images.
Because you met a lot of people and had conversations and sort of did interviews whilst you were there. And
I was very lucky. I had some research leave. I used to work at University of Sussex where I taught photography, and in 2016 I had research leave, and that gave me a whole period of time when I could go down to the plain a lot and actually just talk with people. And you know, I met the mother of a friend of mine who lived in a tiny village very close to the plain, and then it kind of went on from there. So it was absolutely fascinating hearing their experiences of the plain as the inhabitant. You know, I was only the visitor to the plain, and these people had this more insider knowledge, and they experienced the noise day and night, the noise of firing. So I was very interested in that, and I have no idea how we're doing for time, but I could read something out.
Yes, that I think, read something out by all means,
So I was very intrigued by this kind of quote, you know. I would lie in bed at night, and sometimes the activity would go on till 11 o'clock or shortly after, and I actually found it quite comforting, which seems strange, I know, that the sound of large guns firing would actually lull you to sleep.
Wow.
And then, you know, having lived here for so long, it's part of the background, it's part of the wallpaper of the place, and I miss it when it's not there. So I was very interested in that kind of disconnect, you know, between what the sound actually means and how it is actually experienced once it becomes very familiar. I don't think it ever became that familiar to me. You know, every time I went there, if I heard a shell or mortar or whatever, it was still always a shock there. So, you know, there was another, a lady I spoke to who talked about going down to the washing line in her garden. And then suddenly I heard woo over my head, and it was this shell, but I didn't know where it went, you know, I was putting up the washing. So, I mean, just a sort of everyday experience like that. But of course, that is rare. I mean, that was a shell going astray, so it's quite a rare experience. But there are all sorts of incredible quotes from the inhabitants, and you know, it's quite difficult to find people who would say anything sort of critical of the military presence. But I did find people. I found a war tax resistor. I talked to a CND campaigner who talked about how the military is so embedded in the area that actually, you know, it's obviously difficult for her to carry out her work. So yeah, I've forgotten what the question was now.
Oh, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I was just thinking it's such a layered, rich and subjective landscape depending on who's using it and for what reason. And I think your images have captured that beautifully. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So I think we might have to end because we're kind of running out of time. But there's so much more to say. I know you'll be doing more talks about this in future. And,
definitely. Yeah.
Please, for those of you interested, do have a look at the book. Buy the book. It's only just come out, and you can buy it through Impressions Gallery bookshop online. It's priced £30, but during the photo book fair, we've got a 15% discount on all full price books. So I would, you know, take advantage of that. So thank you so much, Melanie.
I just want to thank you, Pippa, because Pippa was my co-editor on the book. And I'm really not very good at sequencing. And Pippa came in and really helped me with the first couple of sequences. And then I tweaked it towards the end a bit. But I don't know what I'd have done without having you there.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
I really recommend having somebody outside the work to help you with your editing. I mean, I edited the work down, you know, from about 1,000 images probably to 50. And then Pippa really helped me with the sequencing and editing. Yeah, and the whole team I worked with were fantastic. Dean Pavitt, the designer, Derry Lewis, the publisher, Matthew Flinton, the essayist, they were all just fabulous to work with. So it was very much a collaborative effort. I'd also like to thank Spectrum Lab in Brighton, who were fab. And in fact, Paul Lowe and I had to look at the match prints and evaluate the match prints in the boot of my car, because I couldn't actually go into the lab. It was just at the very beginning of the COVID crisis. So that was an extraordinary experience with me masked up and us looking at the prints in the boot. And that's how the master prints came to be. So anyway, it was just a fabulous group of people to work with overall. So thanks to you all.
That's very generous of you to say that. Thank you, Melanie. We'll end there. Just for everybody else watching, there are talks throughout the day on Instagram Live as part of our online photo book fair. Again, our website is www.impressions-gallery.com. We've got virtual stalls by independent publishers. We've got exclusive discounts, self-published showcase, photo books galore, and more talks. So do take advantage of that. And thanks again. See you. Bye, Melanie. It was great to see you, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
Bye.